Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of 2 Samuel. Today we're in 2 Samuel chapter 19. And here David is going to return to Jerusalem after all of the issues with the rebellion of Absalom and after Absalom dies at the end of chapter 18. But let's look at some things over the course of this chapter that are valuable for us to draw some lessons from. And there's a lot that we could talk about in this chapter. As a matter of fact, we could probably double the number of things that we're going to talk about today if we wanted to and not have to work very hard at it. But let's look at three things today as we look at 2 Samuel 19. The first one is Joab, and how Joab is going to come to confront David, because David is devastated when Absalom is killed. And he is going to try to go back into his shell, basically, as it were, over the death of Absalom, because he had given orders that Absalom was not to be harmed. But of course, when you're dealing with a son who is rebelling against his father and is leading armies out into battle in order to be able to take his father and to kill his father, being able to take him alive is not always possible. Now, in this case, the option was there, and yet Joab intentionally disobeyed the orders of David. Whether that is known or not, David is acting as though Absalom is the greatest loss of all in all of this. Now, we've seen it, as we talked about in chapter 18, in the love that David has for his children. But Joab is going to come to him, and he's going to basically bluntly put his cards out on the table, because everybody is walking on eggshells around David. They're all going back to their houses, as it were. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to be heard, because the king is mourning for his son. And Joab says, "You have disgraced all of your people." He says, you have all of these people that have gone out and they've stuck with you. They have fought for you. They have stood with you as your son has tried to take everything from you. And yet the only thing that you see when everything is over is that your son is dead. Not gratefulness for those who have stayed with you, not recognition of all of the evil things that Absalom has done and all of the ways that he has betrayed you. But the only thing that you're concerned about is your own grief and your own loss. And then he tells him to go home, to go back to Jerusalem, and to comfort the people who are not sure what to think now because of the way that David has acted. And David is going to do exactly that. He is not going to argue with Joab. He is not going to pretend that Joab doesn't know what he's talking about, but rather he is going to listen to the advice of Joab. Now, this does not mean that his feelings concerning Joab are going to completely be erased, because there's going to be a situation that arises with Amasa where he is going to basically remove Joab from being the head of the army and hand that over to Amasa, both as a means of trying to appease the followers of Absalom, but also as a way of punishing Joab for what has taken place. But then in the second place, you come down a few verses to verse number 19. And there you read concerning Shimei. Now, a few chapters earlier, Shimei was the one, when David was fleeing Jerusalem, who came out and he was cursing him and throwing stones at him and all of these different things. He's a distant relative of King Saul. And so he is coming out and he's doing all of these things to David. Well, now David is the king again. And David is not a deposed ruler, but instead he is the one who is still in charge. So what do you do when you have offended and confronted the king in such a horrific way? And the answer is you apologize and you beg for mercy. And that is exactly what Shimei does. Shimei is going to come and he is going to state that he is the first of the people of Benjamin to greet David, and he is. He knows that he has sinned, and he has. And he is asking for forgiveness from David. Now, David is immediately going to be met by Abishai, who is going to say, listen, just put him to death for everything that he's done and be done with it. And David is going to rebuke Abishai. And he is going to forgive Shimei. There is a message here about forgiveness, about being willing to forgive those that have wronged us, even though they have done it intentionally, even though they knew exactly what they were doing, and they went ahead and they did it anyway. And they did it not because of any major reason other than the fact that they could. And yet Shimei comes back and asks for forgiveness. And David is going to grant it. This is a level of mercy that David is going to show. It's not because he has to. He would have every right to do with Shimei whatever he chooses as far as his kingship is concerned. And yet he doesn't. He shows mercy. And there's certainly lessons for us here when it comes to the way that we deal with those who have mistreated us and those who have sought ill will or had ill will toward us in times past. The third lesson, the third area that we want to see is what happens with Mephibosheth. As you come down to verse 25, David comes back to Jerusalem, and Mephibosheth comes out to greet him. And when he comes out, he is very bedraggled in his appearance. He hasn't shaved his beard. He hasn't washed his feet. He hasn't done anything as far as taking care of himself since David left. He has all of the signs around him of someone who has been worried, who has been concerned, who has not been happy with his situation. Now remember that David has received the report from the one who has been watching over Mephibosheth's land, the one that David had placed there, that Mephibosheth went over to Absalom's side, that he said that this was a victory for him. And so David had basically written off Mephibosheth based upon the report that he had received. And yet here Mephibosheth is, and he's not seeing anything like what the report was. So he asked Mephibosheth why he didn't come with him. And Mephibosheth basically says he was deceived. Remember, Mephibosheth is one who is lame. He cannot walk normally. And so it is very difficult for him to get around, and he cannot just go about freely as he chooses. But instead he says that Ziba, his servant, was one who had slandered him, who had used this as an opportunity to try to remove Mephibosheth from the scene so that he could receive what Mephibosheth had. And then he closes by saying that he is absolutely pleased that David is back. Now, David is going to respond. Remember, he's told Ziba earlier that Ziba could have everything that Mephibosheth had leadership over. All of Saul's lands would be his. Well, now he comes back in verse 29 and says, why do you speak any more of the matters? I have said you and Ziba divide the land. In other words, I'm not going to give it to one of you or the other of you. I'm going to split it between you. Which basically says he's not sure who to believe right now. Mephibosheth comes back and says, you know what, let him have all the land. I don't even care. He says, I'm just glad that my lord the king has come back in peace to his own house. There are a lot of things that we can see here in chapter 19. We could talk about the fighting and the wrangling that goes on between Israel and Judah. We could talk about all of the difficulties that take place with David trying to return things back to normal. We could even talk about all of the politics and all of the jockeying that is going on, not out of true sincerity, but rather out of a desire to hold back on David's wrath, or to try to stop David from doing something to them, or to try to just simply get a leg back up in the kingdom. Because all of those things seem to be taking place here in 2 Samuel chapter 19. But ultimately, the key point of all is that David is still in control. David is still the king of Israel. And the people are back under his jurisdiction, even though many of them were ones that had followed after Absalom. And so while this particular threat from Absalom is now gone, there's a lot of repairing that is going to have to be done in Israel, both of the reputation between David and the people, but also with those various parties who are trying to get back in David's good graces with everything. So these are some of the things that I've seen in chapter 19, and I hope they're beneficial to you. Next time, we'll come back and we'll begin examining 2 Samuel chapter 20. But until then, have a great day.